ladies and gentlemen, Avital Ronell.
When I handed in the manuscript to Bill Regier of a book called Stupidity, one reader's report came back and said, "We'd like a conclusion." And I thought I was done. And so I wrote back to Bill and I said, with the understanding that for Flaubert, the definition of stupidity is the wish and will to conclude, I will deliver such a smackdown to the reader who asked for a conclusion. And then I didn't hear back from Bill, so I was done, in fact. But having said that, with all the anxiety of stupidity that conclusion implies, of course I can't deliver a dialectical summation of what was said and done and thought and unthought and not yet arrived. Even though I am Josephine, queen of the mouse folk, I will squeak my conclusion with pride and dignity and sovereignty. But I would have liked to engage each one of you, and I will. That is a promise and an engagement. I'm still listening in. It'll take me a while to hear. But at this point, I suppose my task is to greet while saying adieu, to help us drop this call and prepare us for a kind of separation that technology promises to bridge, deny, and the 3 V's. Okay, will I get it this time? Verwerfung, Verdrängung, and Verneinung, yes. So the different foreclosive shutdowns that, and denial that technology promises. This is something that I want us perhaps to consider. There's so much that could be said. Let me just say that Nietzsche's model for scientificity and the woman in Nietzsche was Eve, whom you brought us to, Q, very, very insistently and well. For Nietzsche, Eve was the power pump of scientific curiosity. She went up against the man. She did not take on any prohibitions. She is still being punished for her sassy behavior, and she is still paying taxes to that beyond good and evil relation to knowledge. And this is something that for Nietzsche is a praiseworthy figure in the biblical cord that is strangulating us, and for which Hent shamelessly asks for more religion. Are you kidding me? I'm always hearing voices from God, and you don't know what kind of straitjacketing I have to do to not pull the trigger. But in any case, very beautifully challenged and demanded, and we were talking, but you were busy being paged elsewhere this morning about this subversive hyper-theology of the call. So I do want to hook up with your call for that. I of course, resonate to shamelessness of a different sort, and since you switched on the transvaluating machine, if we could think with Nietzsche that there might be a good shamelessness and a bad shamelessness, and the shamelessness that does mow down a certain milieu of otherness, but I would want to discuss with you whether one isn't always talking to an other. It might be another with the another nothing implicated, but I really appreciate that the very notion of shamelessness gets floated here in a certain way, because one thing, now this is more empirical, anthropological for a moment before we take other calls, perhaps, very briefly. One thing that I note, I remember that Derrida said to me when he came back from a trip that the cell phone will have changed everything in terms of milieu and what we get attacked and invaded by in terms of the toxic penetration of the other, what you have to hear about others' conversations on the streets henceforth, and what kind of linguistic pollutants inseminate the invaginated ear, and so on and so forth. I have never heard so much misogynistic injury as I now know when I'm just walking down the street and someone's talking about his fucking bitch, blah, blah, blah. I mean, this is so regular. This used to be disposed of privately, for example. So misogynist injury seems to be, it's not on the rise, but it's more publicly diffused and something you may want to dismiss or drop, or nonetheless be aware of what gets to have a certain kind of free airplay. On the other hand, there might be a really progressive, as you would say, and affirmative shamelessness that gets to happen inadvertently even, and in ways that we want to promote, perhaps. So there's quite a lot that I could say right now. I do want to get back to the beginning, even though the telephone book does set up multiple and duplicitous ears and listening devices and surveillance apparatuses, and also wants to make claims for a certain, following Hélène Cixous, for example, the jouissance of the ear, which is to say, here in some kind of friendly quarrel or différend with Agamben on surveillance, which runs in a way that you all know, and I think you can, without too much concern, get behind, which is how awful it is, and so on and so forth. But what interests me is the desire to be invaded, toxically kind of strangulated by these technologies, the desire to be under surveillance. It wouldn't interest me if it weren't desirable, even in the infantile sense that, by the way, this is like a hurricane here. I'm like, even in the infantile sense of you're seeing people dancing in front of surveillance cameras. So you might see me do that too. But the thing is that what I think is required, I don't like to talk this kind of talk, what's required, what's urgent, and so on, may not be, but is that we think about the more impossible facets and pulsions behind certain things that we think can dispense with Nietzsche, in other words, that are simply evil, malevolent, or disposable. But if we could imagine with certain interest and anxiety, what calls for these intrusions and traumatic zoning ordinances, what welcomes prosthetic supplementation and destruction, and where we get on the death drive, which, don't forget, Freud put on mute. So there's something silent that we're tracking. Now, again, as Alyssa pointed out, I'm not against technology, I'm not for technology, and Heidegger sees technology as a moment of a revelation of truth. and this is what I'm trying to tap into, and the moments where he weakens at the knees about technology, the book argues, is when he gets sucked into the most technologically constellated state, the Nazi state. Gratefully, if you can imagine this, all of this is obscene and impossible to say, but I'm pushing through anyway. Hitler was a technological idiot. His scientists were so ready to blow up this world, and you should see the plans that they submitted to him. And he wanted airplanes that would drop bombs instead of amazingly destructive weaponry and so on and so forth. So there's, even in that state, a kind of contradiction in relation to technology, which it absolutely supported and honored and praised, and the entire an entire nation was addicted to the radio, alternately listening to Wagner and the Führer's voice in a certain way that we might want to consider at another time. In any case, I wanted to point out in some of these efforts what the political implications, the historical, maybe more subterranean logic might be to follow, and which continues to really impose on us all sorts of dreadful decrees about which we might be very unconscious. I don't know if you remember, there was a moment where everyone was in New York on the streets when the Gulf War was about to reignite, and Bush said, he can't stop it now. It's like a technology that's been switched on. So our little subjective protest positions have nothing to do with the on-switch and the inability to close down a technological command. That's why I was very interested in the box and coffin that Lydia Liu brought to us earlier today. So there's something about technology that is, of course, devastating and destructive. However, that's not a good enough, responsible enough stance, I would say. And since you are trained to read and to think and to understand all sorts of complications, ambiguities, and the refusal to make sense, that was something that was brought up as well. I will get back to that. I may need to be reminded. Since you have that ability and also cultural defiance, you're not encouraged by our culture to be readers or thinkers, quite on the contrary. But you're doing it anyway, you're committed, you're engaged, even if you have a whole inventory of resistance, hard to believe, but I know you do. You need to take Husserl's call and the crisis that he named for us and take away science, and Antje was doing this in her way, and her work on the electrophore, which didn't have time to really obviously be developed fully here. The entirely spooky genesis of scientific invention, which has been cleaned up and sanitized and condensed in outrageously fascistoid ways. It's really, I think, incumbent upon us to, I feel like I'm running for office, but I'm not, to take away the thinking of science from a certain kind of objectivist scientifism. So this is what Husserl urged. This is where Nietzsche was plugged in when he wrote The Gay Science. What is the scientificity of of science. What is gay about science? One of Nietzsche's commentators is very quick to say, gay doesn't mean gay in gay science. Okay. That was a Princetonian commentator. So there's something that is calling out to us to respond to with poetic generosity and the ability to hear the poeticity and the altogether hair-raising origins of scientific innovation. There's something that asks that we apply that and return without any nostalgic sense of return, just return to a place that Mary Shelley was very clear about establishing when Victor Frankenstein ran away from Elisabeth, the poetic spirit in his household. Of course, she was German, blue-eyed, blonde hair. I can't help that. But there was something about his alienation and dissociation from poetry that begins the devastating track of science losing its way. This is something that Husserl urges, okay, not by reading Frankenstein, but by worrying about our facile relation to science. This is something that is getting used and perhaps misused in certain philosophical quarters and precincts where perhaps faux scientificity or math themes and mathematics are used to promote knowledge as if there were a cognitive ground again. And you know I love him the way the mafia loves someone, as I said, before they whack him. Badiou, with the authority of ground and math. Don't worry, I'm criticizing. There's something also about the way the humanities weakened, undermined, feminized in certain ways, which needs to be Nietzscheanly strengthened again, that post and position, even though it seems to be undermined at every possible turn, that we might consider with great anxiety. So that's why I also tried to do a biophony, which is to read the very queer and delicate relation between Watson and Bell. They didn't know what the hell they were doing. They were like the little girl in Elizabeth's picture with her hand on the atomic bomb and pretending not to know what she's up to and so on. Leashed to a brother, an older brother, who's manning the whole apparatus and so on and so forth. So I feel like I'm zoning out, and I apologize for these fragments and ricochets, but let me just say that I was trying also to trace a call that was disavowed and spilled when Heidegger spilled the beans, and then I tried to find in the directory assistance in Heidegger's work, and then I'll just explain that and then hang up and dial again. How that worked, most of you know and have done so beautifully in analyzing this. I'm very anxious in doing you injustice and in doing that book injustice as well. So if you could understand my anxiety and predicament, I would be very grateful. So in Heidegger, es ruft, it calls, raises the question of culpability and taking calls. So this is what happened. You've heard it, and you have 2 more minutes of attentive stamina, right? So Heidegger says he has no relation to National Socialism. He's pressed by the press to say, what was your relation? No relation. This is a scandal. how dare you ask me? Come on, you got to tell us what your relationship was to National Socialism. I had none. Silence. Okay, I'm going to ask you one more time. And then he said, look, nothing. The phone rang in my office. I picked it up. That's it. It was the stormtrooper. Not my fault. So I thought, okay, that's the only clue we have. And as a paranoid director of the detective agency where I work, I started my cold and hot cases and tried to understand if that was a clue. That's all we have from Heidegger, really, besides every other Schweinerei and his work and so on. But in terms of, an official designation, it's also problematic that he spilled to the Spiegel when he hates Gerede and inauthentic speech and so on. So is that an irony? The heavy-ass Heideggerians said he was already senile. He didn't mean any of that. Cancel that one, you know? So there's still a lot of squabbles and concerns about that, that interview. And I would ask you again to consider what a philosophical or a philosophical interview is. A lot of philosophers get interviewed nowadays, even though France Culture has dumbed down and thrown out the smartest interviewers. Okay, that's another thing. But what is an interview? Is it a downgrade, or is it where certain things get accomplished and said that can't be said in a demonstrative, philosophical, kosher, okay, not kosher for Heidegger, but kosher way for us in New York today? So that's all he gave us. And there's lots of questions that emerge. Is that legit? Is it illegit? He was, like so many philosophers, against those transmission systems that we associate with public diffusion, such as magazines and newspapers. So was that a cue and a clue? And then I tried to look in all of his work to see what's going on and where I could get some sense of how to work from that minimalist utterance and avowal and disavowal. It came out as a disavowal, so that's all we have in a sense. So in Sein und Zeit and his work Being in Time, he has a lot to say about the call. Heidegger himself said to his friends, if you believe he had any, that he should be known for his work on technology, and it's already a scandal. He decided that he wasn't known for his best work, which is calling out technology. This is where his investment was in many, many serious ways. So here we have a technologized call. The writer of, or thinker of, the question concerning technology, and the thinker of the call. He also tells us in Being in Time where the call comes from. Even if you think it's the most exterior prompter on the side of remoteness and so on, for Heidegger, the call comes from beyond me and from me. So, der Ruf kommt aus mir und doch über mich. So, is this completely coincidental that he gives certain answers, so to speak, and this is said too quickly, and I expressly apologize for the shamelessness of a fast forward here, but Heidegger has a lot to say about what constitutes a call, where it comes from. You cannot get a call that doesn't also simultaneously come from you. So you can't say later on, I got a call and I just picked it up, you know, because to take a call, and what is the predicament of accepting a call, it has to have also come from you. Otherwise, you're not going to pick up the call. This is one of the things that I was concerned about and tried to pinpoint and and anxiously rewind and try again and really give him a fair shake. Now, what does the call say? Heidegger gives us that as well. Any call that arrives, should it arrive, is independent of content or signification, but says one thing: guilty. I know that sounds like a strange Deleuzian crime fiction novel, but that is the way I like to proceed sometimes. It turns me on, it's as technology does, and it is something that I go after in a certain way. So I have very, very much to say to you. I'm wearing down because I'm not a replicant, but I wanted to just show a little bit about the first part of the book, where you start almost with the toe of a dinosaur and you're trying to reconstruct and recreate psychoanalytically, historically, and otherwise what kind of story you can have. Lydia mentioned that there was some nonsense in play, and I'm taking that out of context, but that is something that's been said. And that is also, if I can take another call right now very briefly, and then you can ask me questions and put in your calls. There I'm following Bataille probably and Nancy, and worried about too much sense, because fascism makes sense, and it's restricting the semantic and sense-making field, and throttles the possibility of what can be meant or said or spun out or understood. So in a sense, I was very, well, I kind of had a gun to my head, because I am a reader of Bataille, and as a certified obsessional neurotic, when someone says something, it's an order, I have to take it. Bataille says, stop making sense. That's a responsible stance, plus you'll take a lot of shit for it, but you can't just offer, deliver, make sense as if there weren't mutations and absolute catastrophes that disrupt our relation to sense, and even acts of sense-making, which are extreme falsifications. So if technology, let's call it that, by the way, that's a very catachrestic and abusive translation of Technik. Sam Weber doesn't translate Heidegger as technology, but technics. So I thought, really, if I'm going to talk about technics, is anyone going to give a shit? You know, because that's maybe too safe for what I was trying to do. It may make sense. It does make sense. Sam Weber is a very powerful and strong reader of media and technology and violence. But I felt I needed to take the risk of recovering my name as it was known in graduate school, where everyone called me Miss Prison, which means, if you've read The Anxiety of Influence, it means that you're misreading in a kind of conscious and driven way, which is the way to resignify, perhaps, follow the mutations where they take you, and not show yourself entirely subservient to inherited sense. But don't get me wrong, in order to give oneself license to do so and have a certain free range of motion, you have to go to obedience school first. And hello, German department, PhD in German. I have been to obedience school. I still am. It's on me. It's all over me. And so I'm extremely disciplined. And when I get occasional furloughs or passes to experiment, it's on the side of duty. A sense that, seriously, that something needs to maybe be ruffled or be part of that thinking that we talked about earlier, which involves the Heideggerian and Levinasian Stoß, or being prompted and prodded and a little mauled by what you encounter, and understanding that that sometimes, well, I'm not going to go there because I want to wind it down now. I just thought that I would also point out that for me, in a certain way, the telephone has everything to do with the command, Lazarus, arise. So it's also, in the ways that were described, part of an impossible relation to departure and death that continually reiterates the "come here, I want you." Thank you. Any comments? Any questions? Something I haven't said that you need to hear about, or any of us weren't adequately addressed? These discussions were formidable and important. But is anyone? It's good to be dissatisfied. That'll keep you energized for the next round you have in your work, which I urge you to do also carefully, because I think you do have to measure the risks you take. Things are not easy, and especially now with so many of the great thinkers on the way out, or out, but not over and out, and talking to us from elsewhere, you're in a difficult position. Those of you who are starting out, you need a lot of protection, more than you know, and a lot of vigilance, and yet you have to be fearless. And that's very difficult to, attentional structure, that's very difficult to maintain. And sometimes, frankly, it might not be worth it to be fearless. It's a real, you do donate your body, and you are made to pay for things. A lot of you in here have I would count among those who have taken those risks, and I'm very proud to be talking to you and with you. Does anyone have anything that needs to be considered, or are we ready to go into Halloween? The other Halloween, the Halloween of the other.
We have wine and cheese.
We do have another reception desk, which is that of wine and cheese. So let's continue our conversation. Thank you, Anne, Ben, and your teams. You're amazing.